Thanks, Austin. The tech team has told me that we're having some difficulty online, but they're working to get that worked out, so thank you for hanging in there with us. And we want you to know that we're glad that you're watching wherever you find yourself this morning. Obviously, this is a Sunday, unlike any other Sunday, during a time that's at least unlike any other time that any of us have ever experienced. And that being said, while we wish we could be together, we're certainly glad that you're watching, and we look forward to being together in the future. Our plan as of right now is to live stream every Sunday at 11 a.m. for as long as we need to, and you can watch that on our website at www.firstchristianmonticello.com or through the FCC app. And then also on Wednesday afternoons, we're going to be posting a brief devotional video throughout this time, some point in the afternoon that you can watch as a family in the evening. Also, Miss Anita and our FCC Kids team is going to be posting a video at 1 o'clock today. So if your kids have been involved in our FCC Kids ministry, we want to keep that going. So at 1 o'clock today on the FCC Kids Facebook page, there'll be a video that will be up today, so be watching for that. We're going to do our best over these next few weeks to stay as connected and focused as we can. And we need you to help us by taking this time seriously and tuning in whenever you can. Earlier this week, my mom sent me a list of the benefits of online worship. Now, when you pause to think about it, there's a lot of things that are different. There's a lot of things that can't really compare to gathering together in one physical location, but there are a few positives. One of the positives they mentioned was that there's no parking problems. Another, you can wear your pajamas if you want to, and nobody's going to judge you for that, at least outside of your own family. If you're a person who struggles to get here on time during a normal service, with the online worship, you can just rewind it and watch whatever you missed before. Here's another positive. If you want to drink your coffee and eat your breakfast during the service, you're more than welcome to do that. And there's one more positive that was listed, and for some reason, my mom had this one circled and highlighted and said this: one of the benefits of online worship is that you can mute the preacher anytime you want to. And I'm not sure why she had that highlighted, but that's certainly an option that you have. If you have a Bible with you or a phone, I want you to turn to Mark chapter 4. And while you're turning there, I want you to imagine this scene. There's a family of 5, a mom, a dad, and 3 young kids who live in a normal-sized house in a small rural community. And recently, through no fault of his own, the father has lost his job, and now he faces an uncertain season of unemployment while wondering how he's going to feed his family. At the same time, because of some social upheaval, the family has been cut off from their support network. They can't engage in any real business to speak of. They can't get together with their extended family, and it's not safe for their church to meet together. And for this family, every day has become a battle against fear, anxiety, isolation, and doubt. And every night, after the parents tuck their children into bed, they then spend hours tossing and turning, wondering when, if ever, things are going to get back to normal. Now, if that sounds like what your family has been experiencing over the last few days, I want you to know you're in good company. The scene I was describing was the reality for those early Christians living in and around the city of Rome around the year 66 AD, when the Gospel of Mark was written. Now, when you open up the Bible, you have the Old Testament and the New Testament. When you get to the New Testament, it starts with what we call the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each of them tell the same story, but each of them was organized and written with a specific audience in mind. And the audience that Mark had in mind as he wrote his gospel was those Christians living under severe persecution in and around the city of Rome during the second half of the first century. Historians tell us that Mark, the person who wrote this, was an associate of the Apostle Peter. And Peter was living in Rome during the time that the Roman Emperor Nero set about to persecute the Christians. He set about to systematically eliminate the early church. And as a part of his program, he had them arrested, he had them imprisoned, evicted, they were fired from their jobs, they were crucified, some of them were burned at the stake, they were thrown to wild animals, they were even torn apart by lions as the crowds cheered their deaths. And it was at that moment that Mark, under the direction of Peter and under the influence of the Holy Spirit, sat down and wrote out the story of Jesus. But as he wrote, it's important to understand, he didn't just give us, dates and summaries of events like a normal biographer would do. Instead, he included stories that he knew the people living under those conditions needed to hear. And one of those stories is found in Mark chapter 4. Now, if you grew up going to church, this is probably a story that today, it takes an entire day teaching this large crowd of people from a boat that's been pushed off a few yards from the shore. The crowd was so large, the only place he could stand without being overpowered by the crowd was in this boat, and then speaking back to the people on the shore. At the end of the day, Jesus is understandably tired, so he looks at his disciples who happen to be in the boat with him, and he instructs them to take him to the other side of a lake. If you want to read along with me, we're in Mark chapter 4, verse 35. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. Now, what I want you to catch here is that this is just a normal day in a string of normal days in the life of Jesus and his disciples. He's surrounded by the guys that he's closest to. He spent that day doing what he did most every other day, teaching the crowd at his assembly. So this is just a normal day. There's nothing out of the ordinary happening on this day, at least not yet. Now look at the next verse, verse 37. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Now, all of this took place on what's known as the Sea of Galilee. We would call it more like a lake, comparable in size possibly to Lake Cumberland. What made the Sea of Galilee special, though, is the lake itself was 685 feet below sea level. It was surrounded by mountains on all sides that ranged in height from 1,500 to 2,000 feet. So the lake itself sat down in sort of a little bowl. And that means whenever a storm blew up, it was particularly powerful. And that's what happens here. The disciples begin making their way across the lake. Everything seems fine. The skies are clear. The water's calm. But then in the middle of their journey, the skies opened up. The wind picked up. The waves started crashing. And before anybody even realized what was happening, they find themselves in a very serious situation. And just to reiterate the seriousness of the storm they were facing, Mark calls it a furious squall. In Greek, it's the same word that we would use to describe a hurricane. Now, I don't have to tell you that in many ways the past 10 or 12 days have felt much like an F5 hurricane that swept across the world, and many of us never saw it coming. But now we find ourselves living in a time in which this virus is spreading, the economy is getting smaller, businesses are struggling, schools have shut their doors, churches are empty, and people are scrambling for supplies. And here's the thing about storms, they affect everybody. You've been affected by this. I've been affected by this. I mean, when a hurricane blows through, it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, white or black, educated, uneducated. Doesn't matter what your job title is. Doesn't matter the size of the house you live in or the type of car you drive. When a storm comes in, it affects everybody. The other thing that's true about storms is that they come in a lot of different forms. Sometimes it comes in the form of a new virus that nobody knows much about. Other times it comes in the form of a lost job or a cancer diagnosis, a broken relationship, a family dysfunction, economic uncertainty, unexpected death. I mean, there are a lot of different types of storms, and no matter how much we try to convince ourselves, nobody is immune from storms. Jesus said it like this in Matthew 5. He said, He causes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. That means that when it comes to storms, all of us are in the same boat. That being said, That means the only thing that you and I really have control over when it comes to storms is our response to those storms. So I was thinking about this past week, and there are a lot of different ways that people normally respond to storms. You've seen some of this played out in real time. And the truth is that a lot of us have chosen to respond to this current storm in different ways. One of the ways that sometimes people respond to storms is that they fixate on the storm. I want you to imagine that rather than taking place in the first century, that this storm had taken place in 2020. Now, if that was the case, the disciples and the friends of the disciples, they would have been able to watch 24-hour coverage of how this storm was unfolding. They could turn on CNN or Fox News. They could watch as different, meteorologists stood in front of this map where the Sea of Galilee is highlighted in red, and they could try to predict the exact moment that the storm was going to hit, how intense the storm would be. Then they could bring on this so-called, panel of experts to talk about the political ramifications of the storm and how it might affect the next election. At the same time, over in the corner of the screen, there'd be this little ticker that showed you what the stock market was doing in response to the storm. Then when that was over, they could cut into a press conference that was already in progress, in which various government officials give us more information about the ongoing storm and encourage us to follow specific guidelines. Once you had enough of that, you'd go over to the Weather Channel, and there'd be this guy standing on the shore of the Sea of Galilee with the waves, crashing up behind him, looking like he's getting ready to blow away and trying to predict what the storm surge might be. Then when that was over, you could turn off the television, you could get on Facebook or Twitter and scroll through, and you could watch as everybody shared their opinions about the storm. One person says the storm's overrated, another person says this is the biggest storm in the history of storms. And see, if this storm had happened in 2020 instead of the first century, I'm pretty sure that's how a lot of us would have responded, because to be honest, that's how a lot of us have responded to the current storm. And the problem is that fixating on the storm doesn't change the storm. I mean, you can watch everything there is to watch, you can read everything there is to read, and you can keep yourself up 24/7 trying to keep up with the latest news, but none of that does anything to alter the storm. Here's another option that people sometimes choose. You can panic because of the storm. One of the things that's so interesting about this story is that at least 4 and possibly as many as 7 of the 12 apostles were professional fishermen. For many of them, this had been their family business. They'd been raised on the water, and this wasn't their first storm. I mean, during their careers, they'd been through lots of storms. And yet there was something about this storm that was different. The intensity of the storm, the suddenness of the storm, it caught them off guard. Now, if you've ever been on an airplane, you're flying somewhere, and you hit a little turbulence, and you notice that the flight attendants start to get nervous, that's a good sign something up. And if the pilot comes out of the cockpit and he or she is wound up over this, then you know you've got a big problem. And that's where these guys were. They were professional fishermen, and they were still scared. And the picture you get at the end of verse 37 is that the waves were crashing in over the side of this boat, and because of that, the boat was nearly swamped. That means that there was more water coming over the sides of the boat quicker and faster than they could remove it, and it was starting to look as if they weren't going to make it across the lake. Now, have you ever found yourself in a situation where the bad news was coming in quicker than you could process it? Maybe you're living in that situation right now. How do you respond to that? Well, some people, they stay up all night worrying about what's going to happen next. Maybe you go through your day, you do okay during the nighttime, but at different times during the day, you feel that anxiety sort of rising in your chest and causes your pulse to quicken. It's interesting when you look, the Greek word for worry that's used in the New Testament literally means to choke. And that's what worry does to it. It chokes the life out of us. You felt that, and so have I. And if we're honest, panic and worry don't really accomplish anything. All they do is make us feel worse. So you look at Mark chapter 4, it's important to understand that the disciples' panic did nothing to remedy the situation. Just like fixating on the storm doesn't affect the storm, neither does panic because of the storm. Here's a third option that some people choose. They choose to party in spite of the storm. Back in 1969, there was a powerful F5 hurricane named Hurricane Camille that struck much of the eastern coastline. And to this day, it's still the second most powerful hurricane that's ever made landfall, with recorded and sustained winds of over 200 miles per hour. In anticipation of that storm's arrival, officials from the National Weather Service, in conjunction with many state officials, mandated evacuations from areas that they predicted were going to be hit the hardest. And to their credit, most people complied. There was one group, however, who decided to stay where they were and just ride out the storm. They were guests at the historic Richelieu Hotel that was located just 1,000 yards from the beach in the town of Pass Christian, Massachusetts. So rather than checking out and relocating further inland to get away from the storm, there was a group at this hotel of 25 people who got together and they planned what they called a hurricane party. As part of their preparation, they set up this huge buffet line, a huge well-stocked bar, and a dance floor on the roof of this hotel. Their plan was to just sort of party into the night and watch as the storm rolled in. One of the guests at the hotel was a lady named Mary Ann Gerlich. Now, she told a reporter from the New York Times, "We all thought watching the storm would be great fun." Now, she and her husband were so keyed up for the party that afternoon they retired to their room and they decided to take a nap so that they'd be well rested for the night's festivities. The problem was that the storm came early and they were awakened by the sound of 25-foot waves crashing into the side of the hotel. When the storm finally calmed down and the waves receded back out into the ocean, Mary Ann Gerlich was one of two people that had survived the storm. 23 of the hotel's 25 guests were killed. I've got a picture of the remains of the hotel that I want to show you, just a big pile of debris. Now, if you're like me, you hear that story and you wonder, why didn't they listen? Why didn't they prepare like they should have? But when you think about it, in many ways, a lot of people in our culture do the same thing. Even some of us have done it. One of the things that's clear as you read through the New Testament is that over and over again, Jesus warns us that these storms, what we call these storms of life, are going to hit. And yet so many of us go through our day-to-day lives as if we're immune to the storm. In one sense, there are a lot of people who are sort of partying their way through life, and at the same time, they don't realize that there's this hurricane that's bearing down on top of them. In John 16, Jesus said it like this. He said, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." What he's saying there is that in this world, we're going to face storms. We live in a storm-prone world. And pretending that these storms will never hit or never affect us is a recipe for disaster. So there has to be a better way. And as you look at this passage, you see there is a better way to respond. Rather than fixating on the storm, rather than panicking because of the storm, rather than partying in spite of the storm, the answer and what you and I need to be doing is praying through the storm. When you get to verse 38, the disciples who are in the boat with Jesus do something that all of us should be doing. I want you to read this with me. Here's what it says. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Now, if you know me, you know there's not too many things that I'm good at, but one of the things I am good at is I can sleep under almost any conditions, which is really a gift, especially when you have two newborns at your house. A few years ago, I got on an airplane in Lexington. I fell asleep before we took off, and when we landed in Seattle, I woke up when we were getting off the plane, slept the entire time. I can sleep anywhere, and maybe you can too. But in this situation, I'm not sure even I could have slept. Because here are the disciples, man, they're fighting for their life, and they look up, and it bothers them because they're fighting for their life. They look up in the stern of the boat, and there's Jesus, and he's asleep. Let me ask you, you ever found yourself in the middle of a storm when it felt like Jesus was asleep? You ever found yourself going through something and you wonder, why isn't Jesus stopping this? Maybe your marriage fell apart. Maybe you lost your job. Maybe somebody you love got really sick. Maybe a virus attacked your state and paralyzed a lot of people. The more you thought about it, the more frustrated you got, because it felt as if Jesus was asleep when you were on the verge of drowning. There's something I want you to see as you look at this story, though, that I think is really important. As you look at verse 38, as soon as the disciples cried out to Jesus for help, Jesus heard them. Now, maybe they woke him up, or maybe he wasn't asleep to start with. Maybe he was just pretending to be asleep in order to see what they were going to do. But here's what I do know. A lot of times, whenever we think Jesus is asleep, he's just listening. And he's waiting for us to cry out to him. And the implication is that whenever we cry out to him and we ask him to help us, he responds. Now, to be sure, he doesn't always respond like we want him to respond. And he doesn't always respond at the time that we want him to, but he always responds. Check out what he does in this instance, verse 39. He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. And he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Verse 41, they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." With just one word from Jesus, the rain stops, the wind dies down, the waves calm, and the storm dissipates. And sometimes it's like that. Sometimes it just happens instantaneously. Sometimes you pray and God speaks and everything clears up in a moment. Other times it takes a little longer. But what I want you to notice in this story is in verse 41 is the disciples' reaction to Jesus. It says they were terrified. Literally means they feared a great fear. Now make sure you catch this. In one moment, they went from being afraid of the storm to being afraid of Jesus. And why were they afraid of him? They were afraid because at that moment, they realized that Jesus was no ordinary man. Now, to be clear, they should have already known that, but just like us, they were prone to forget. And every once in a while, they needed a reminder as to who Jesus really was. Sometimes, as painful as it can be, we need the same reminder. Proverbs 16:33 says it this way: "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord." Then you get to Colossians 1. The Apostle Paul makes it even clearer when he writes these words about Jesus. He says, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, for in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him, and for him he is before all things, and in him all things hold together." One of the beliefs that we sometimes talk about as Christians, but then tend to forget about in times of trouble, is this idea of the sovereignty of God. As Christians, we believe that God's the creator of the world, he's the sustainer of the world, and since he's the creator, he's ultimately in control of the world. To be sovereign means to have ultimate authority. That means that when it comes to storms, it's God who decides when they hit, how intense they are, where they hit, and how long they last. Now, if it was up to me, I might choose to do it differently. But I'm not in charge. He is. And when you realize that, that means that some of this pressure that some of us are feeling to control the environment and to make sure that everybody and everything is okay, that sort of goes away when you realize that's not your job, it's God's. The famous preacher C.H. Spurgeon said it this way. He said, when you go through a trial, the sovereignty of God is the pillow upon which you lay your head. Listen, if I thought that I was in charge of the world and I felt like I had to solve all the problems that we're facing, I'd go crazy, and you probably would too. But the good news is that's not our job. Our job is to do the best we can and trust God to do whatever it is He wants to do in order to accomplish whatever it is He wants to accomplish. If you're following along with us at home, there's an essential truth that I want to make sure you get today, and it's this. Whenever it seems like everything is out of control, remember that God is always in control. Let's say it again. Whenever it seems like everything is out of control, God is always in control. Now, I don't know how it is for you, but for me, it's easy to believe, that God's in control when the skies are blue, the stock market is up, the church is full, everybody's healthy, the bills are paid, and my team is winning. But every once in a while, I have to remind myself that even in the middle of a storm, God's in control. And since He's in control, that means I don't have to be. As you look at this passage in Mark 4, there are 3 questions that sort of frame the whole scene. The first question is found in verse 38, where the disciples wake up Jesus, and one of them asked Him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Now, that's a question of desperation. That's the kind of question a person asks when it feels like the wheels have come off and you're heading toward a crash. And as you've lived through the last 10 days or so, my assumption is you've probably asked some questions of your own that might fall into that same category. You've probably asked questions like, what if I get the coronavirus? What if my kids catch it? What if my mom or dad gets sick? What if I lose my job? What if I can't make my house payment or my car payment? What if the economy collapses and we go into a recession and my retirement suffers? What if we never go back to school? If you're a parent, you might ask the question, what if my kids never go back to school and I have to homeschool them until they graduate? What if I run out of medicine? What if I run out of food? What if there's no cure? What if we have to spend the next 18 months quarantined in our houses? What if the world comes to an end and we drown in the middle of this lake? Those are the kinds of questions that people ask when they're scared. But as you look at Mark chapter 4, the question that the disciples asked is not the most important question. There's a more important question. It's the question that Jesus asked at the end of verse 40 when he looks at His disciples, this group of men who should have known better, who's already seen Jesus do incredible things, and He says to them, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" "Yeah, but Jesus, what about my job and my house payment and the stock market?" And Jesus says, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" "Of course I have faith, Jesus, but what about the virus? And what about the quarantine? What about the storm?" And again, Jesus says, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Of all the questions that might be running through your head this morning, that may be the question you need to spend some time thinking about. As you look closely, though, there's another question here, and it's the most important question in this entire story, and it's especially significant at a moment like this when it's found in verse 41 when the disciples look at each other and they ask, "Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey Him?" Here's the deal. Once you understand who it is that controls the storm, the only thing that then makes sense is for you to ride out the storm with Him. So with that being said, I want to encourage you this morning, no matter what kind of stress you're under, no matter what kind of questions you may be asking, take some time and rather than fixating on the storm, rather than panicking because of the storm, I want to invite you to join me in praying through the storm. See, the thing about storms is that no matter how long they last and no matter how intense they are, they always come to an end. And when this storm ends, and it will, I hope that all of us will say that we use this time to grow closer to the one who controls the storm. Our worship team is going to come back, and we're going to sing one more song together. If you know the words, I want you to sing in your living room. And then when they're done, I'm going to come back, and I'm going to lead us in a closing prayer. But my hope is this would not just be something that we sit down and we watch and it sort of goes in one ear and out the other. I mean, this is a story that everybody knows. My hope is that this would be a story that we're living in, but that we can come out on the other side of this better, stronger, and more focused than ever before. I hope you'll sing with us.